Hi everybody. This week we're going to be taking a short look at both adolescent and adult learning, and then you're going to have a chance to pick which of those areas you want to go a little bit more deeply into. So the foundation, or I guess the first person who really talked a lot about learning beyond the age of 13 or so, is a psychologist named Erik Erikson. And his psychology, he was a student of Freud, and as you know, Freud kind of believed that everything derived from sex. Everything, learning, um, any achievement goals, all of that was sublimated sex drive. But basically, Erik Erikson and his wife, who worked closely with him, veered off from that idea. And he said, no, really, we spend our lives constructing ourselves. His is a psychology of self-construction. So here are Erikson's life crises or stages. And what he does is he sees each stage of life as a choice that people make between two alternatives based on a key question. So much like Piaget or Freud for that matter, he sees the age of 0 to about 1.5 as unique. And this is when the baby is deciding trust versus mistrust. Can you trust other people to meet your needs? Can you trust the world? Is the world a trustworthy place? So that a baby that is not taken care of, whose basic needs are not met, will often make the choice that the world is not trustworthy. People are not trustworthy. Okay, 1.5 to 3, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Can I control myself or will others control me? And this is the classic toilet training age. Okay, and what Erikson brought forward here is that a child who at this age is basically controlled in what you and I would think of as a behaviorist fashion, although he certainly didn't write about it that way, is a child who does not learn to control themselves, does not believe they can control themselves. 3 to 6, initiative versus guilt. Am I basically good? And the question here for the child, from the age of 3 to 6, children have enormous curiosity, enormous impulses to mess with their world. And as a parent, I can tell you this sometimes drives parents crazy. But a child who is told no too often in this age, Erikson would hypothesize, is a child who learns that their basic impulses are not good, that their basic impulses, the things that they want, are wrong. Now we get to school age 6 to 12, basically elementary school, maybe a little bit of middle school here. Industry versus inferiority is the big decision being made here. And the question is, am I capable? You can see how school would so enormously impact this. Am I capable of doing things? Can I learn how to do things? Or am I inferior? Am I unable to be capable? Unfortunately, I think our schools too often send children a message that says that they are not capable. Adolescence is the classic identity crisis, identity versus role confusion. Who will I become? During adolescence is when children try on lots of different identities. And this is the classic teenager who, 1 month is a goth, and the next month is a preppy, and the next month is an athlete, and the next month is a theater buff, and the next month, they're always somebody different. It's almost like they're play acting, but what they're really doing is trying on various identities. Young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. Can I love and be loved? And this is about not just romance, but the building of lasting friendships, Erikson would believe. He says that our most lasting friendships are built in our adolescent and then into our young adulthood. Middle age, generativity versus stagnation. Am I productive, useful, helpful to others? Am I just sort of coasting along? Is my life just going by me? Or am I generating something of use? Am I producing worth? And old age is when you look back at your life, integrity versus despair. Has my life been worthwhile? Now, Erikson did his research on Harvard graduates. And so there are a certain number of limitations there. At the time that he did his research on Harvard graduates, for one thing, they were all men. And of course, also, the people who graduate from Harvard have probably slightly different life paths than the people who graduate from ordinary colleges or the people who don't even graduate from colleges. So, in many ways, his research itself has been challenged. His childhood work, he did not actually study children. What he did is he used the recollections, the retrospective impressions of the Harvard students that he studied to look at the children section here, the stages of childhood. And his wife, who lived longer than he did, in one of her last interviews, was heard to say that they had greatly underestimated the challenges of old age, too. So, in a way, this setup, this series of life crises, does not rest on a real solid research foundation originally. But what's interesting is that this has been very generative work. Many, many people have used Erickson's stages, various stages, to launch their own research and have confirmed a lot of what he talks about. Now, what's really nice about Erickson is that instead of, I mean, he talks about stages here, but he doesn't believe that once you've made your decision, it's all over. So a baby, for example, who is not properly taken care of when very young may decide that the world and other people are not very trustworthy, but later experiences can help them change that. And so for Erickson, it's never over. You revisit these questions over and over and over again, and you have a chance to fix things. So I find that kind of helpful. Anyway, this theory makes a good setting specifically to think about adolescents as they move into young adulthood, because in Erickson's days, young adulthood, I think, was pushed off a little further than it is today. And then adult learning, because people that we have studied, like Piaget and even Vygotsky, are mostly looking at how children learn from adults or by themselves. So I think this is a nice framework for thinking about our two ages that we're going to look at this week. And let me just give you a taste of what we know about adolescence and how the various characteristics they have and why they have them. And okay, basically in our society, the dilemma of adolescence is that adolescents are sexually mature, but they are not emotionally mature, mentally mature, or socially mature. And what I mean by that is that children are going through puberty at earlier and earlier ages as the years go on. The average age of puberty has been dropping. So they are sexually prepared for adulthood, but emotionally they're not mature, mentally they're not mature, and certainly in the eyes of our society, they are not mature. So let's look at some of these tensions that they face. One of the things we know about adolescents, and you may remember this from your own teenagehood, is that adolescents tend to be very moody, very emotionally intense, and they go up and down a lot. This is because the limbic system in the brain matures earlier than the cerebral cortex or the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is the part of the brain that is responsible for emotion. So an adolescent basically has all the emotional impulses of an adult, but nothing that controls it. We're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex in a little bit. Adolescents are notoriously late to bed and late to get up. And this is not just because they're stubborn and they want to party all night or whatever. It's basically because adolescents have a reset biological clock. Young children tend to wake up early in the morning and go to sleep fairly early. As a group, that is not true of all young children. It wasn't true of my son, but it's true of most of them. And then as you move toward adolescence, your biological clock, your day shifts so that you tend to go to sleep later and later and want to get up later and later. And this goes on throughout adolescence. And then when it's interesting at the other end of life, when you're an older person, it shifts back again. So, for example, my dad always used to get up at 6:45 every morning, all the way through all 20 years of his retirement. And, but Lord help you, at 9:30 at night, he was wiped. So a lot of older people have that very early biological clock, Adolescents are exactly the opposite. And there have been a number of studies done showing that if adolescents started high school at 10 o'clock in the morning instead of 7:30 or 8, which is more typical, they actually do better. So that's an interesting one. Adolescence and brain pruning. Early adolescence is one of the key times for the pruning of unused connections in your brain. There are several key times. Actually, you're remodeling your brain all your life by using it, because basically your brain every once in a while goes through and discards all the circuits that aren't being used to make room for new stuff, which is, I mean, it has to do that. But at early adolescence is one of the big times that that happens. So basically, whatever early adolescents are doing, their brain will continue to keep those connections. But if they're not using those connections, they'll be pruned. So it's basically use it or lose it. What we have found about the brain, and this goes on through your whole life, but as I said, one of the big pushes is in adolescence neurologically, is you know how with your muscles, if you don't use your muscles, they tend to atrophy. They tend to get worse. You lose muscle fiber. Okay, it's worse in your brain. If you don't use a neural pathway, it eventually decays and it's gone. It gets pruned out. So this is a real warning to us as educators, but also to adolescents, that maybe, just maybe, sitting in front of a television for 8 hours a day is not the best use of the adolescent brain. Okay, I told you we'd talk about the prefrontal cortex, impulsiveness. Adolescents as a group tend to be pretty impulsive. And the reason for that is that my very favorite part of the brain, which is right here in the center, right between your eyes and above them, right in the center of your forehead, if you go back from there, that's where you'll find the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is my favorite part of the brain because it's the part of the brain that says, hey, whoa, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a good idea. It's the impulse control center. It is one of the very last parts of the brain to mature. It actually is not completely mature in most people to the age of 25. So basically what's going on with adolescents here is they have a fully mature limbic system. They have all the emotions of an adult. They're very powerful emotions, but they don't have the brakes yet. They don't have the part of the brain. Their prefrontal cortex is not yet fully myelinated, which means that the neural sheaths have not totally coated all the nerves in that area, which means basically you're getting a lot of short circuits. And so their prefrontal cortex is not fully online yet. The prefrontal cortex is the part of you, as I said, that controls impulses. And what's a little fascinating about it is it's also one of the first parts of you to go offline if there's anything wrong, one of the first parts of your brain. So for example, if you're very tired, you'll find that you're more impulsive. Or if you're sick, you're more likely to give in to impulse. You'll say things you didn't want to say. You'll do things you didn't want to say. If you are inebriated, your prefrontal cortex is gone, which is why drunk people do things and say things they wish they hadn't. So it's a fascinating piece of the brain. We think evolutionarily it's one of the later parts of the brain to develop. And in terms of each person's history, it is definitely the latest part of the brain to come fully online. Adolescents are known for risk-taking. Well, we've found out why. Adolescents, in the adolescent brain, when they do something risky, it releases dopamine, which is the feel-good chemical. Children's brains, adults' brains don't do this, but adolescents do. So it actually feels good to them to take risks. So this is why adolescents are the ones who love horror movies and things. Anorexia is a problem that typically arises in adolescence and continues into young adulthood. Again, that's partly due to the brain, and interestingly, it's due to a serotonin imbalance. And finally, Piaget actually wrote about adolescent egocentrism. Adolescents think it's all about them. In other words, the whole world is watching them. This is part of what we call the personal myth. And you probably again remember when you were a teenager, if your hair wasn't just quite right, didn't want to go to school because it's like everybody will look at me. Everybody will see how horrible my hair looks. And of course that's not true. Everybody's not watching you when you're a teenager. They're all concerned about themselves. But for adolescents, they're always on the center of the world stage. And so everybody's looking at them, everybody's watching. They're intensely self-conscious. But they also tend to think the world revolves around them. So, as part of the personal myth, what happens is most adolescents think that bad things happen to other people. This also goes with the risk taking. In other words, if I am the center of the universe cannot get along without me. So, other people may have car accidents when they speed, but I won't. Other people might get pregnant if they have unprotected sex, but that won't happen to me. That only happens to other people because I'm really, far too significant in the world for these bad things to happen to me. And that's again explains why insurance companies find that drivers under the age of 25 are the most expensive to insure because they're most risk-taking types of drivers. Anyway, that's a little glimpse at what your first thing that you're going to look at talks about in adolescence. It's a TED Talk by Sarah Jane Blakemore, who is a neuroscientist, and it's about the adolescent brain, and she talks about all of these things actually much better than I do. Okay. The second thing, if you choose to read to go more deeply into adolescence, that you'll be reading is a review of Richard Lerner's book, The Good Teen. And I obviously didn't want to have you read the whole book, but this review pretty well recaps the book. And what's interesting is that Lerner is basically standing against the more traditional view of the adolescent that I just presented to you and that Sarah Jane Blakemore is going to talk about in her TED Talk. And then finally, you'll read an article by Strom et al. About adolescent learning and the internet and how the internet is changing. I'm not sure if they're saying that it's changing the way adolescents have always learned best, but certainly how they have to learn in schools. So I think those are three articles you'll enjoy a lot if you choose to look at adolescence. Now, the other path you can take is looking at adult learning. And Malcolm Knowles is sort of the father of adult learning research in this country. He did not coin the term, he borrowed it from a German researcher, but he made popular the term andragogy, which is pedagogy but for adults, andra being adults. And some of the principles of his idea of andragogy, which he wrote about from 1950 until his death in 1997 as a professor emeritus at North Carolina State, these are some of the basic principles that he wrote about. He said adults, unlike children, need to be involved in the planning and evaluation of their own instruction. Experience, including mistakes, should provide the basis for all learning activities with adults. Adults are most interested in learning about subjects that have some immediate relevance to their job or to their personal life. They want to learn about what they perceive they need to learn. And adult learning, this is his probably most famous saying, is that adult learning is problem-centered rather than content-oriented. Now, the reason there's a big question mark at the bottom here is that one of the things I'd like you to think about is the influence of Knowles' ideas of andragogy back onto our current ideas of pedagogy. In other words, what he's proposing is true about adults are some of the things that now we are saying about adolescents, certainly, and even perhaps about K-12 students in general. So anyway, if you choose to look more deeply at adult learning, you have a chapter in the textbook about adult learning that will recap most of Knowles' ideas, because Knowles mostly wrote books. So again, we're not going to have you read the whole book. And then an article by Clapper saying, let's move beyond Knowles. Yes, Knowles had some good ideas, but let's take it further. And finally, a short video in which an instructor of adult learners talks about the fact that she believes that the first task that we have when we're teaching adult learners, for example, all of you, is to help you overcome sort of the non-learning habits that you've developed in school, or at least the habits that are no longer useful for your learning as an adult. So if you see yourself eventually as a professor or a teacher professional developer or something like that, adult learning might be what you want to take a look at. Anyway, so you have choices of two paths. I hope you enjoy whichever one you pick. And then you have some optional articles in each path. For the adolescent path, obviously one optional thing you can do is just read both paths if you just have way lots of time this week. But if you want to go a little bit further in your chosen path, our own Donna Alverman from the University of Georgia is the author of the white paper on adolescent literacy for the Learning Research Association. She is probably the best, one of the best known, if not the best known researcher in adolescent literacy. And she's pictured here with one of her favorite people, or furry people, however you want to think about it. And then there's an article by Adams talking about making learning matter for the multitasking generation, which kind of takes us from adolescence into young adulthood. The idea that the people who are from maybe 25 down nowadays have grown up multitasking and being able to learn from multiple different sources simultaneously, and how does that change how they need to learn in schools. And then in terms of adult learning, and that's kind of a halfway bridge article, it's a little bit about adolescents and a little bit about young adults. And then I do have an article by Malcolm Knowles, who's pictured here, and it's called Lifelong Learning, a Dream, in which he himself takes his basic principles of andragogy and imagines an entire society where all learning occurs in that way. So it's definitely a vision, a dream type of thing, but it's kind of fun to read. So anyway, I hope you enjoy all of that and enjoy your week, and I'll